Welcome to this Constitutional Commission meeting on the role of broadcasting in Scotland. We have an excellent panel tonight. Now, a few words, if I may, about the Constitutional Commission, who we are. There are some details on the display panels at the back of the room, but if I can just say a few words. We're an independent, non-partisan Scottish think tank research and education charity. You'll notice there's a little box outside for donations, and that's because we're a charity. Thank you very much. Our aims are to promote the development of education, citizenship, community development through a better understanding of constitutional matters, structures and processes. And that's just a long-winded way of saying that in this island we operate under the aegis of an unwritten constitution. Why is that remarkable? Well, it's remarkable because there are only two other countries in the world, aside from the UK, who operate on the basis of an unwritten constitution. Israel and New Zealand. And we have one other remarkable element to our constitution, and that is that it allows clerics to make laws. There is only one other country in the world which permits clerics to make laws. That's right, Iran. So the UK is in very good company there. Let me just say a few words about our president. The president of the Constitutional Commission is Canon Kenyon Wright. Kenyon helps to preserve the continuity going way back to the Constitutional Convention. And the Commission came about because Kenyon felt that he wanted to make an additional contribution. Kenyon is now based in Stratford-on-Avon, and this was, it seemed to us, pretty much the best way of tapping into his talents and at the same time making it possible for him to make that contribution. And he's very, very active. He is studying the Scottish media pretty much 24/7, and I've yet to come across any constitutional-related subject upon which Kenyon does not have a very, very strong view. So he's with us in spirit, at least. And one of the products, if I can just end this section with a plug, one of the products of the Constitutional Commission is this very worthwhile book by Elliot Bulmer, who's our research director, who unfortunately can't be here tonight because somebody at Oxford University wants to speak to him tomorrow, so he needs to travel. But it's all blushes aside. It's a very, very good production. And Alex, whom I mentioned earlier, has multiple copies of this estimable tome. So anyone who wishes to part with £10, Alex would be more than happy to reciprocate by giving you a copy of this book. It's mentioned, by the way, for those of you who read the Sunday Herald, it's mentioned in this extract, which is entitled, from Sunday's Glasgow Herald, "Do Scots Need the Lords?" Not the Lord, the Lords. And it's an attempt to look at the place of the House of Lords and the latest attempts to reform that institution. The role of broadcasting in Scotland. We have an absolutely wonderful group of panellists tonight. And let me just spend a couple of seconds, if I may, though you may recognise everyone here, just take a couple of seconds just to say a few words about each of our panellists. Ian McWhirter, on my right, is an award-winning political commentator who has worked both at Westminster and Holyrood for more than 20 years, presenting major BBC news programmes such as Holyrood Live and Politics Scotland. And he played a key role in forming the Sunday Herald in 1999, and Ian currently writes for the Sunday Herald. And in fact, the two contributions that I particularly liked in the Sunday Herald this weekend are Ian's and Elliot's. The Scotsman and the Guardian, and he was also rector of Edinburgh University between 2009 and 2012. Welcome, Ian. Professor Tom Devine is Senior Research Professor in History at the University of Edinburgh and Director of the Scottish Centre for Diaspora Studies. Arguably the most distinguished and well-known historian in Scotland, he has published 32 books, 32, including The Scottish Nation, which at the time outsold the Harry Potter series, I'm told. For only 2 weeks. For only 2 weeks. And the most recent, which is To the Ends of the Earth, Scotland's Global Diaspora. Tom is the face and voice of Scottish history, and his dominance in the subject has recently earned him the sobriquet, the big beast of Scottish history. Tom has promised us he's going to be explosive tonight, so that's going to be great. Ewan Crawford. Ewan started his career as a journalist in England before joining the BBC, and has produced major news programmes, including Good Morning Scotland and Newsweek Scotland. He spent 4 years between 2000 and 2004 working closely with John Swinney, who was then leader of the Scottish National Party. And he continues, as you know, to write for the Scotsman, the Guardian, other newspapers, as well as appearing on a number of BBC programmes. He is also a lecturer at the University of the West of Scotland. Welcome. Joan McAlpin. Well, we're in Joan's office right now, so it's almost invidious of me to introduce her in that sense, because she's more at home in this place than perhaps I am. Obviously, former Scottish Journalist of the Year, editor of the Sunday Times in Scotland, and deputy editor of the Herald, and she's widely known as one of the most important figures in Scottish journalism. And anyone who read her blog, Go Lassie Go, will see that she used the blog to make sure that people, I suspect, really got a chance to look at some of the issues in more detail, but at the same time in a very accessible way. And she does that consistently in her columns in the Daily Record. And she obviously serves as an SNP MSP for the South of Scotland and as a member of the Education and Culture Committee, where it says here she has more than once grilled BBC representatives to the bone. I'm not quite sure what that means. Gracious. Thanks, Sashi, but I'm not quite sure what it means. Okay. And last but by no means least, Kate Higgins, who is an effective campaigner and fundraiser at Capability Scotland and on the Civil Society Media Limited. Kate is also policy manager for Children First. She again writes for the Herald Scotsman and online blog sites such as Bella Caledonia and National Collective. And I hope you've all had a chance to look at her own blog, which is Bird's Eye View, spelled with a Z. And she's an active Twitter, it says here, where she tweets almost every hour. So I hope she's going to take a little bit of time off tonight. Now, Kate can't be with us for the duration, so her place will be filled by Pete Murray of the National Union of Journalists when she needs to leave. And I'd like to also thank our sponsor this evening and ask him to say a few words before we move to the first of our panellists this evening, who will be Ian McWhirter. Our sponsor is Patrick Harvey, MSP, leader of the Scottish Green Party. We're very much indebted to Patrick. Unfortunately, I have to say that none of our distinguished panellists can quite achieve the status that Patrick has achieved, where he has been roundly condemned and disparaged in the Daily Mail. So I thank all the panelists for being here, and I thank Patrick for sponsoring this evening. And Patrick, perhaps you could say a few words before we move into the main business.
Thanks, John. Not just the Daily Mail. I was the recipient of a complaint on grounds of blasphemy from Donald Trump. I'm even more proud of that than I am of the Daily Mail sobriquet. Can I thank you for the opportunity to host the evening. It's the easy bit of my job is just to book a room, and it's a privilege to be able to bring in and welcome external organisations to take part in debates which are relevant to Scottish politics, and I'm very pleased to have that opportunity. way before I was ever an MSP, or even thought there would be such a thing as an MSP, I was a wee boy whose dad came home from work every day at the BBC, and who would grumble about what was being done to the organisation and about everything that was being done wrong in his view, and still sometimes grumbles about those things in a constructive way, of course. So I'm someone who cares very much about broadcasting, and although I might not share every view that the current Scottish Government has about the future of broadcasting, it seems to me that the opportunity of the debate around the referendum, almost whichever decision the Scottish people make, and I'll be arguing for a yes vote, but whichever decision the Scottish people make, we have the opportunity to recast our approach to broadcasting in a way that serves the interests of Scottish viewers and listeners and surfers and readers and all of the rest of it, much better than they're served at the moment. So I look forward to the debate, and I'd like to welcome you all here.
Thank you very much, Patrick. You may recall from our first meeting, which took place a few months ago, when we discussed this a state fit for the 21st century, that the format we will use tonight is very much based upon the question time approach, i.e. that I shall invite each of our distinguished panellists to speak for 5 or so minutes, and then once they're all through, to invite them to take your questions. So this is a real opportunity for you to participate in the development of this subject and to examine some of those areas with this distinguished group tonight. I suspect there probably won't be a better chance than there is this evening, so make full use of it, I would suggest. I'd like to call the speakers in the following order, if I may. I'd like to start with Ian, and then John, and then Ewan, and then Kate, and finishing off with the explosive Professor Tom Devine. So, Ian, can I hand the floor to you?
Well, okay, so the first question we're meant to address is how good is Scotland's broadcasting at representing Scotland to the world, and how good the Scottish broadcasting is at representing the world to Scotland, because obviously in a country which is in a stage of national self-discovery, the broadcast media are tremendously important. It's how the national conversation is conducted, it's how people form, on the whole, form their political attitudes or derive their political information, and therefore their idea of the kind of country that they're living in. I say it's the state of broadcasting is better than it was a few years ago. It's still far worse than it could be or should be. I maybe don't entirely subscribe to Tom Devine's view that it's basically as an insult to Scotland, the BBC. It has been certainly letting the country down in many respects, not least in terms of the amount of broadcasting of network commissions that were being made. That's the amount of money that goes into the broadcast media in Scotland. And as a result of the setting up of the Scottish Broadcasting Commission in 2007, which made some very trenchant criticisms of the way the BBC behaved, there were a number of important changes made. So the number of network commissions by value has increased very substantially, about 3 times, I think, what it was. It's now about 9% per capita, whereas it was about 3% before. And that is quite a significant change. But it hasn't altered the fundamental problem with broadcasting in Scotland, with the BBC in Scotland, which is essentially it's not tooled up to be a national broadcaster. The idea is it's meant to be local broadcasting, and it's funded in that, from that point of view. It's sort of encapsulated in the way they used to describe the kind of mission statement of the politics show on the BBC, that it was from Downing Street to your street. So the Downing Street bit is the bit that comes from London, and the your street is the bit that you get locally from your local station. Now, people in BBC Scotland, as you and I'm sure will confirm, have gone to extraordinary lengths in recent years to manage to make something out of the very minimal resources that they have, to try to make something which credibly sounds like a national broadcasting organisation, but it's nothing obviously like that. You can tell that in the extent to which the funding is different north of the border for comparable programmes. I mean, as you were saying, I worked for the BBC for 27 years, and I worked for a large part of it in Westminster, presenting programmes like Westminster Live. and then coming to Scotland in 1999 and presenting exactly the same programmes here. And the staffing was totally different. I mean, there was about a quarter of the staff and about a quarter of the budget that was allocated to the comparable programmes in Westminster. And when I sort of raised this with BBC executives and said that, you know, there doesn't seem to be any reason why broadcasting from the Scottish Parliament should be funded at a different level from Westminster, I was always told, well, you've got to remember that Scotland has only a tenth of the population, so you can only really expect a tenth of the budget. And that never seemed to me a very credible argument, but it's one which is very pervasive in the BBC. The fund, they don't have a sense of benchmark funding. In other words, they don't say that political broadcasting or current affairs broadcasting should be done at a certain level, whether it's in Scotland or whether it's in England. So you're always going to get this impression that it is a kind of hand-me-down, north of the border, kind of threadbare. So what's going to happen if broadcasting was devolved to the Scottish Parliament, as I think it almost certainly will be, almost whatever happens now, because there's going to be another round of devolution of various powers under Devolution Plus, Devolution Max, and obviously if there's Scotland votes for independence, then there will be the setting up of a Scottish Broadcasting Service, an SBC. And I don't think that would be that much different actually from what we're seeing at the moment. If it was simply devolved to the Scottish Parliament, again, it wouldn't be a huge difference, but I think it would be a significant difference because at least the committees of the Scottish Parliament would be able to call the BBC executives on a more regular basis because they would have a degree of oversight. Now, oversight does not mean political control. If the Scottish Parliament had responsibility for broadcasting, at the moment it's reserved exclusively for Westminster, it wouldn't mean that Alex Salmond was setting the running order of the 6 o'clock news. But it would be a significant difference. And you would find that the BBC executives would have to justify themselves to a democratic forum. And it's, you know, it's important to, when Joan and her committee had representatives of the BBC, I think you had Mark Thompson up here, didn't you, and gave him a bit of a hard time. I mean, that they do notice, they take note of these things, and you will find that things do change as a result of that. So political oversight has a significant role to play, even though it doesn't involve itself in any sense in editorial matters. But there is a bizarre thing, which is that the way things are standing, you could conceivably have a Leveson-style press regulator north of the border, because the press is not reserved to Westminster, but not broadcasting north of the border. I think that would be a very curious anomaly, and I think that's why I'm pretty sure, as a result of the Leveson process and as a result of the attempts to, if only to head off independence north of the border, that there will be broadcasting, will be devolved to the Scottish Parliament in fairly short order. So I don't think that things are too bad. There's a bit more money going to broadcasting in Scotland. It's doing its best with very limited resources. It's losing a lot of staff just now. It's very unfortunate the BBC is doing that on the eve of the independence referendum, but it's subject to financial constraints which it's not really able to avoid. And I'd have to say, finally, coming from the newspaper world, which is in a state of extreme distress at the moment. In fact, there's a real possibility of the Scottish press almost ceasing to exist as far as the so-called Scottish quality press is concerned. So I'd have to say, looking at it from that point of view, then, you know, the broadcasting environment is not that bad, and perhaps we should be thankful for small mercies.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ian. If I can ask Joan now.
Okay, thank you very much. I wish I shared Ian's optimism about the state of broadcasting. I know that perhaps that's over-egging it, but certainly from the evidence that we took at committee, Stuart Maxwell, the convener of the committee, is here, didn't really give us a great deal of encouragement, particularly in terms of the BBC, who until very recently the management was refusing to come and explain itself to the committee, and it was only by writing to Lord Peyton recently that today we were able to say that he had asked them to reverse their decision, and the management are now going to come and speak to the committee. But some of the stuff that came out when Pete Murray, who's here today as well, and his colleague from Bectu were giving evidence to the committee was really of great concern, in that BBC Scotland's money is being cut by 20%. So it's 102 million just now, and it's going to be cut to 86 million, and that's in cash terms, not real terms, between now and 2018. So it's very, very substantial, and that's at a time when we should be having a national conversation about the constitutional future of the country. If BBC Scotland was in a position to already be producing the kind of quality programmes that you see in the rest of the network, perhaps taking its fair share, which is the argument that they were making to us, would be reasonable. But as Ian has outlined, the benchmarking, despite the best efforts of the many talented people that work for BBC Scotland, the benchmarking is absolutely appalling, and that affects the kinds of debates that you're able to have. Now, when BBC management came in front of the committee in May, Mark Thompson actually refused to say how much money was spent on Good Morning Scotland as compared to the Day programme. He said that was a matter of confidentiality, that somehow it would compromise them as a commercial as a competitor with commercial organisations, but I just don't think that has any credibility whatsoever. But I was grateful to Pete when he came before the committee a few weeks ago for the NUJ, who, because of their internal knowledge, was able to give us at least some kind of idea of the way the resources stack up. Now, if you look at the lunchtime programme on the BBC, on the radio, Johnny Beattie's programme has 2 producers and 1 assistant producer. The equivalent in London, The World at One, has 2 editors, 2 senior producers, 4 junior producers, and 1 assistant. Obviously they'll have more input in terms of presenters as well. Now, I think that comes out very, very clearly, no matter how the quality of the people who are working on it. I think that comes out very clearly in the kind of way that they discuss things. And I know that the bias is mentioned in the title to this, and after watching Ian Davison on Newsnight, I'm not going to get into any accusations of politicians accusing journalists of bias, because it was just so cringeworthy. However, I think, lack of resources in a big UK-wide organisation like the BBC does actually affect the way that you cover stories. And just one example from that Johnny Beattie show a while ago, which really, really struck me when I listened to the show while driving up from the south of Scotland. The living wage had been upgraded that week. And so there was a big discussion about the living wage. Now, this is a good example because it's a non-political example. I could say, well, this SNP government are implementing the living wage in Scotland, but you could also say you could look at it from a Scottish point of view. That we had a Labour member, John Park, who was putting a private member's bill forward in this Parliament discussing the living wage, and you could also look at what Scottish local authorities were doing. Like, for example, Glasgow claimed to be the first local authority to introduce it, but none of that was covered in this very long discussion about the living wage on the Johnny Beattie show, because they went straight to the Westminster correspondent. They had stuff from Boris Johnson in London, and they had stuff from Westminster, and they didn't pay any attention at all to what was happening in Scotland, which is absolutely extraordinary from a point of view that it was the sort of flagship lunchtime bulletin. I don't think that was because of an inherent bias on the part of the journalists. I just think that was because their news gathering abilities are extremely limited, and to do it in Scotland you'd actually have to go out and conduct the interviews yourself. It's similar in the same programme. I think this was a good example as well of how the restriction operates. Someone had been mentioning, a listener had got in touch to talk about coming back from Canada after 20 years and noticing a decline in Scottish brands. And this had produced a lot of tweets and emails from readers sort of reminiscing about Scottish brands. And the response of the programme's producer was to go to a professor dealing with brands in London, who then they had quite a long interview with him talking about British brands, because they didn't actually have the research capability to go out and find somebody to speak about it in the Scottish context. That's just one example. I could rhyme off lots of others, and I don't want to be hammering all the time at the BBC. It's just an example of how a decline in income can affect actually the content that you put out. And I think this is particularly marked. Ian mentioned the decline in Scottish print media recently. If you look at when we saw the rise of television, if you look at how media was delivered in Scotland, say round about, say, 60 years ago, when the coronation, when a lot of people bought televisions, there was a huge indigenous Scottish media, but it was publishing and it was newspapers, and people were able to exchange ideas and talk about their country and their culture amongst themselves and to the world. Now, all those, the publishers, the newspapers, they have all gone into decline. I'm not just talking about the national newspapers, I'm talking about local newspapers, you know, which used to be, you know, very, very lively opportunities to debate politics as well. So they've all gone into decline. So the broadcasting is even more important, and obviously the BBC as the public service broadcaster is particularly important. In the last 15 years, you've seen the BBC respond very well in a national and international sense to the changes in media, and that we've now got new channels. We've got BBC 3, BBC 4, you've got 5 Live, you've got all different platforms where they deliver news and current affairs and drama to different audiences in different ways. And in Scotland, it's stayed the same. We haven't been able to respond in the same way. And as a smaller country within a larger culture in the UK, I think you can say that they've produced more content, but if it's scattered around, there is actually no way where you can have that national conversation. And that's why I think the Scottish Digital Network was so important, why it was so important that we got cross-party support for the digital network when it was discussed in the Parliament. And if I could just say, just to finish off with one last thing, is that I think it's really important that it doesn't become a party political issue caught up just in the constitutional debate, because whatever your position is on the Constitution, I think that Scotland as a nation ought to be able to talk to itself and project itself to the world. And what I'm concerned about is that efforts to improve broadcasting in Scotland and improve the way we share information will be stymied by people taking party political decisions because they feel that expressions of Scottish culture somehow drive people down a particular route, and I think that would be a shame.
Thanks very much, John. Ewan, if I can ask you, and then Kate. Thank you.
Excuse me, I'm just going to talk briefly about the general broadcasting environment and then about the situation in Scotland. It's important to remember that broadcasting, both Ian and Joan have mentioned the decline of the press, but broadcasting environment is changing quite dramatically, and the kind of debates that broadcasters have is very different to what it was even 10 years ago. There's a lively academic debate about whether we can even still talk about broadcasting because of the multi-channel era, whether it's not more accurate to talk about narrowcasting, where with all these channels you have small niche audiences as opposed to the huge mass audiences of the past. Can we also still talk about public service broadcasters when broadcasting companies now offer complementary online offerings to most things that they actually do? So it's important in the debate to look at the environment going forward as opposed to the environment of a few years ago. Having said that, some of these issues shouldn't be overstated in Scotland. Academics often talk about the decline of television now, whether rightly or wrongly. In Scotland, we are world-class television watchers. We watch on average 4.5 hours a day, which is larger than the rest of the United Kingdom. Also, the internet, although most people in this room are probably very internet savvy, and certainly people in the media are, we forget that large numbers of people in Scotland don't even have access to broadband. Only 68% of people in Scotland actually have broadband, only 60% in our largest city, and rather scandalously, among households earning less than £17,500, only a third of those households actually have broadband. And I think it's a big fear that there's a new form of social exclusion opening up there. Now, for those reasons, perhaps television is more important in Scotland at the moment than other countries. I think if we're looking ahead to what we're hoping for, well, so I'm hoping for an independent Scotland, and the debate about whether we should have a Scottish broadcasting corporation is to look at what the purpose of a public service broadcaster actually is in this changing environment. The functions of public service broadcasters have changed, although some are constant. The main justification for having a public service broadcaster is the idea of the audience as citizens, not consumers. The commercial channels will cater for consumers, but will they necessarily cater for citizens? There have been other important themes originally, the kind of Reithian idea of a cultural impact of having a higher culture. That's diminished in some respects, and the BBC and other broadcasters have embraced more the idea of a public service broadcaster as a window on society that it's broadcasting to. The idea of representing diversity is very important for public service broadcasters to justify their position, somewhat paradoxically as well as reflecting diversity. Public service broadcasters are also there to bring the nation together. And you could see in the Olympics coverage the importance of the BBC in that in terms of bringing the UK together. Now, as someone who's a supporter of independence, we shouldn't gloss over the fact that small countries do have particular issues. That to make a television programme, there are fixed production costs, whether you are broadcasting to 100 million people or to 1 million people. And that does present certain challenges to small countries that we shouldn't gloss over. But if I can talk specifically about the situation in Scotland, our main public service broadcaster is the BBC, although interestingly, ITV, Channel 4 and even Channel 5 are defined by the UK government as public service broadcasters. But clearly the BBC is the main public service broadcaster. It has a number of public purposes which relate in some respects to these general purposes that I was talking about. One of them is the idea of sustaining citizenship, clearly related to the idea of seeing the audience as citizens, not consumers. The BBC is regulated by a trust. In their last report, they said there was a gap in terms of understanding politics in the nations and regions. This was the feedback they were getting. And I just think on a practical level, if people like me, that I have young children, I'm doing other things at 6:30 at night, I don't watch Reporting Scotland or the STV News, my next opportunity on BBC One to see Scottish news is a 7-minute bulletin at 10:30, which often will have 3 stories because, again, people have spoken about staff cutbacks. Sometimes packages will not even be recut. So they might just play out 2 or 3 stories from the early evening bulletin. Now, clearly, I just don't understand how the BBC on its main mixed genre channel, BBC One, can say it's sustaining Scottish citizenship when you're getting 7 minutes of news after 7 o'clock. So notwithstanding the fact that there are small country issues, at the moment, almost anything would be an improvement in that regard. This idea of diversity as well, the BBC has a public purpose of representing the UK, its nations, regions and communities. Again, the BBC Trust in its last report said this year the gap widened, particularly the portrayal of nations and regions. And I think Ian's mentioned the fact that the BBC has decentralised. Now that's true to a large extent in terms of production. But I think the fear is that Pacific Quay, this lovely new digital headquarters in Glasgow, to some extent is becoming a big production house. Now that's good in terms of jobs, although again there are issues about how many of these jobs are actually local. But the kind of basic function of BBC Scotland being a window on the society, on the community it serves, I think there's a real issue there. If you look at Ofcom figures, year-on-year spend, in the latest Ofcom market report, year-on-year spend by STV and BBC combined on first-run originated programming for viewers in Scotland was £53 million. That's across both of BBC and STV, our major broadcasters. Over 5 years, that spend has decreased by 24%. Now, it's important to say this is not some sort of anti-Scottish thing. This has happened across the UK. So spending on programmes for Wales, Northern Ireland and for the English regions has also fallen. So you've got these two processes at work, I would argue. One, programmes that would otherwise have been made in London, the M25, now being made outside, but still the same programmes. And programmes that are meant for what's called local audiences, the amount of money being spent on those is declining dramatically. So even notwithstanding the fact that Scotland was independent and you have these small country issues about fixed production cost, almost anything would be an improvement now, I would argue, in terms of reflecting Scotland on screen. And it's particularly acute at peak time, between 7 o'clock and 10 o'clock. On average, you're probably going to get per week on BBC One and BBC Two, maybe 2 hours a week. More days than not, you might not see anything specifically about Scotland. Now, that might not be an issue for some people, but in terms of being a window on the society that the BBC is broadcasting to, which should be one of its core functions, I think there are issues there. Finally, obviously, the cutbacks that are taking place are severe, and Joan's right, this shouldn't really be a party political issue, but they're having already a dramatic impact, I would argue, on news coverage, notwithstanding what the BBC Scotland management says. I think as we look forward, there are other examples we can look to across Europe. You could look at maybe, if you like, the Rolls-Royce of small country broadcasters, which would be Denmark. Denmark has its public service broadcaster, the DR, has DR1, DR2, a children's programme, a culture programme, a 24-hour news programme, an HD channel. It has a production fund, and it has something like 7 or 8 regional stations in a country the same size of as Scotland. Now, of course, their licence fee is a lot more. You could look at a different model, which is Ireland, which wouldn't be appropriate for Scotland with its dual funding model. But it shows that there are examples out there outside of the United Kingdom that certainly I think we should be looking at as we're thinking about going forward, whether or not in an evolved or, as I would hope, in an independent context.
Thanks very much, Ewan. I noticed Katie didn't mention Borgen. Did you notice that when he talked about Denmark? Okay.
Yes, you'll be pleased to know I'm not actually going to talk about Borgen this time, and I am going to preface my remarks by apologising, because I'm more or less probably going to say my piece and listen to a bit of Professor Devine's and cut and run, and I apologise for that. I managed to double book myself, but I have a hot ticket for a Saint Etienne gig and a Scritti Politti gig, and they don't gig very often if anybody knows about them, so I'm afraid I'm not missing it, not even for all of you. I have to say there's quite a lot of doom and gloom, and a lot of it is justified, but I want to take a slightly different approach and present a few challenges and try and present a slightly more glass half full approach. I think the first thing that it's good to remind ourselves is that there's more to broadcasting than the BBC, and that we already have an independent Scottish company in STV, and you know, it may have its faults and its weaknesses, but it's there and we own it and it's ours. And whether or not we vote yes, and I sincerely hope we do, in the independence referendum, we still have an independent commercial broadcaster. And also we have huge swathes of radio stations. We have BBC Radio Scotland, but we also have commercial radio output and also community radio. And I think we need to be careful not to just limit how we approach broadcasting by looking only at what the BBC contributes now and can contribute to our future as a nation. I think the other point, and the second point I would make, is that Scotland is not North Korea. We are not just limited to our terrestrial channels, and other commentators have made that point as well. You know, the media and broadcast media is not traditional any longer. There are social media, there's new media, and as Ewan pointed out, multimedia channels. And I think again, we should start thinking about our broadcasting output, and certainly in the context within which we sit, which is as global citizens, where we can all access channels online. I was one of the people watching the US election results online through kind of independent US channels, and following live blogs at New York Times. At the same time, I had about 4 or 5 different threads going between laptop and iPad and TV and radio. And, you know, it was instrumental in basically receiving lots of different views and viewpoints on the presidential elections. And so, you know, whether or not we become independent, we are not living within simply the kind of the geographical confines of where we are in terms of how we in the future will access our media output. And I think as well it's important to realise that, and this is perhaps more acute for somebody like me who works in the sector that I do, that it's not always about inputs in terms of equating with outputs and outcomes. And absolutely hear and agree entirely with what Joan was saying about how concerning it is about how limited income, and really startling figures that Ewan presented to us there about the limit in production of a total spend of 52 million, given that, you know, even if we just took the 10% share of BBC licence fee into Scotland on day one of independence, it would amount to 325 million, which is not a small sum. So to the fact that there's only 52 million across both BBC in Scotland and STV at the moment being spent on production is alarming. But actually, you know, again, if you equate it even with Hollywood, it's not always those who spend the most on what they produce that create the biggest bang for their buck. And we have to not just look constantly at what we put in terms of what we get, and that then equates to a quality product, because there are different ways and different models of doing that. The next thing I want to say is probably a bit of a heresy, in that I was one of the people who was very upset at losing BBC Six Music off my digital channels when BBC Alba went on to Freeview. I have to say, I was most nonplussed, because I'm a non-Gaelic speaker, I'm a lowlander. And why, you know, I felt quite that this was an imposition on me, when actually I spend most of my evenings with BBC Music through my telly in the background to what I'm doing. But actually, what it meant me doing was I eventually got out there and finally bought myself a digital radio. So I now have BBC Six Music in the kitchen playing, which again, you know, is part of the fact that we are global citizens, and we are not just restricted to being Scottish, but our tastes and our culture and our influences are shaped by a whole range of contributors. But actually, I love BBC Alba, and my 9-year-old son regularly appears with bizarre Gaelic phrases that he's picked up because he's been watching something that's been in the background. And actually, it's news and current affairs output in terms of taking a non-traditional Scottish view, and certainly doing that role that Joan spoke eloquently about Scottish window in the world, and the conversation we have ourselves is actually really important. So I've gone from being a naysayer to an avid watcher, and I think there's lessons in that for all of us. The other thing I want to say is 2 things really around the issue of political coverage, if you like. I think there's something in how we approach. There's just something I think about being careful about audiences. And I think there is an equation to be had, exactly the point that Ewan was making about citizens and not being consumers. I think there's a relationship and a correlation to be made by the very narrow confines in which politics is reported in this country, and disengagement and disenfranchisement, and the actual fact that so many of our audience of 5 million citizens in Scotland is actually crowded out of that debate. And a good example of that to some extent is the focus in the last week about the he says, she says over whether or not Scotland would be a member of the European Union without actually exploring any of the issues about the desirability of Scotland being in the European Union as an independent country, what European Union membership can bring it. But it's been debated on a very narrow, linear approach, on a very polarised approach. And I think that turns off a lot of audiences, and I think it's both a correlation with and a symptom of where we sit in terms of political debate in the country. And I really would like to see a real wholesale shift in how we cover politics in Scotland, and that actually engages women, engages children and young people, engages black and ethnic minority communities, engages people at the lower end of the income scale in a much more creative way, and actually brings them into the debate. At the moment, we have a very narrow number of people who are allowed to debate on in our broadcast media the big political issues of the day, and they're either paid politicians or they are commentators, and yes, I am increasingly one of those now, but actually it's still a very narrow gene pool, and I don't think that that does our political discourse any favours. And one of the things I think that sometimes, I think in terms of the debate that we're about to have and the conversation with ourselves, I remember a few years back that Channel 4 did a really interesting thing with citizens' juries, where it had panels of experts, if you like, and commentators debating a topical, thorny issue and quite controversial issue of the day, but it had people there in the audience, and they actually really got into the nitty-gritty, exactly the kind of thing you were talking about, Joan, where, you know, there's a very kind of surface view taken, a very narrow approach that sometimes doesn't even have a Scottish context to it, but really analyses, forensically analyses, and allows people, and at the end of those programmes, people actually took a vote on what they thought, and very often from the beginning of the programme to the end, because they've been given the opportunity to explore their views and the evidence on an issue, their views change completely from the beginning to the end of that. And I think that's the kind of national conversation we need to be having about the big issues about our constitutional future. And just one final point, I think, is just to say that, having talked quite a wee bit about politics, there's more to our broadcasting needs and interests than politics. And as an independent nation, this to me is exactly where our glass is half full in Scotland. You know, let's go all the way back. We invented television. We have given some of the best media voices and programmes in kind of broadcasting history. We have huge creative talents out there. We need to invest in those skills. We need to find ways of enabling them to use different platforms and not just traditional media. And we also need to build on our strengths. And one of Scotland's strengths is children's programming. We contribute more to the UK output in children's programming than any other nation in the UK. And there's something that we can be selling to the world and we can be rightly proud of. And there's something to build on if we become independent. And I'd like to just finish on saying that I actually think, yes, I think there are a lot of concerns. I think there are issues around how broadcasts and where it sits at the moment in terms of its income. But actually, our glass is half full, but it's also filled with a bit of a tension. And one of the things I picked out of, I think that summarises well that tension, is that in 2011, one of BBC Scotland's huge success stories was the fact that it live streamed the World Pipe Band Championships to 82 countries. Live streamed an event happening in Scotland to 82 other countries. But there's the tension there about, does that reflect the modern Scotland that we think we are and that we want programme and content about, or does it reflect a Scotland that the rest of the world thinks still exists here? And I think that's a tension that, however we take forward broadcasting, we need to resolve, and it's actually quite a big part of our national conversation with ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Kate got slightly more than her allotted 5 minutes because she won't be able to stay for the duration. Well, there we are, Tom. The glass is half full.
Well, good evening, everyone. I was going to be explosive, but I had a terrible experience yesterday morning in London where I was...
Sorry, could you switch your mic on?
Sorry, I don't believe in technology. Thank you. Can you hear me? I had a terrible experience yesterday morning in London appearing on a show chaired by Andrew Marr, and there was another person on it called Alistair Gray. And Alistair Gray is a well-known Scottish novelist and painter or artist. And I was saying to some of my colleagues, Andy Marr tends to go on and on and on and then ask the question. So he asked the question, and Alistair Gray fixes him with his gimlet eye and says, no. And Andy Marr says, well, can you not expatiate a bit more? No. And then the next question, you know, the answer to it is yes. And of course, Metropolitanism can't stand this. Andrew Marr is currently in intensive care, and his 2 female research assistants are receiving counselling. And because of that, I can't possibly be explosive as I wish to. The other thing is, during the course of this evening, I may have to mention not names but offices. Is that allowed?
We'd have to worry about the context, but we can certainly edit stuff out.
The context is semi-libelous.
Oh.
Well, you asked me to be explosive, didn't you?
Well, the film crew are quite happy to edit you up.
I will not mention it in my 4 minutes or 5 minutes. So basically, as the chairman has said, I'm an historian, and therefore the basis of my own trade is evidence. And in thinking about tonight and being aware of the fact that I'm an innocent in the media field, I decided to try and accumulate evidence. I decided to try and find out what those who know the trade better than I do are observing. And the 2 groups I have contacted, which will form the basis of my remarks, are first producers, and I haven't gone above producer level, producers, senior producers as well, who have spent time in the area that I'm concerned with. My concern tonight is not with broadcasting in general, but specifically with Radio Scotland, which of course has much greater time coverage than any of the other outlets that we've been discussing so far. And the other group are those individuals who very kindly, despite the fact that they are still employed by the BBC, were able to say things to me off the record, knowing that under no circumstances, except if News of the World type values are offered to me, would ever give away their names or their addresses. Okay? What I want to do in the 2 or 3 minutes I've got is not to complete the story, but to provide you with a taster of what I hope I'll be able to say during the course of the debate, either through the invitation of the chair or if questions are asked. Because the latter two areas which I think should go into the meat of the debate is why things have happened to Radio Scotland over the last 10 years, and most importantly, because I will try to be as positive as I can, what in terms of the professionals should be done to try and resurrect the channel to the position it should be in, as people have been implying, has to be in the newly emerging Scotia. Now, there is one further point before I begin, and that is there's been much attention paid tonight to resource. The general view of those individuals, and there was about 8 or 9 of them that I spoke to, is that if there's a division of interest between resource and attention to what should be done, it's the latter which is the more important. This is not to say that Radio Scotland and the Beeb in general in Scotland does not require more resource. Of course it does. And there are some very illuminating comparisons with Radio 4 in terms of protection and particular programmes of the flagship nature on Radio 4 which have been protected over time, which I don't know whether your committee dug up this information, because my sense, Joan, was that the BBC representatives, despite the grilling, got away with murder, especially in relation to some of the things I've been learning over the last week or 10 days or so. Radio Scotland wins for the second year in succession Station of the Year award. The controller of Radio Scotland has established such a national, international reputation that he is headhunted by Radio 4 to become their next controller. The Scottish press regularly enthuse about Radio Scotland as a vibrant and very relevant station. The Sony Award in the period I'm talking about, the Sony Award, which is the Radio Oscars, was given to GMS, Good Morning Scotland. Nominations to these awards occurred regularly, or did occur regularly, at that time. Staff morale was high. The station took pride in its status and on the accolades given to it. And again, there was hardly any dissent in the sources that I inquired of, hardly any dissent about that statement that I've given you. But that statement refers to the 1990s. It does not refer to the year 2012. So we fast forward. A contributor earlier this year in spring to the I Write Festival, in a debate more generally about the Scottish condition and about Scottish independence, off the cuff says, BBC Radio Scotland is a national humiliation, cheered to the echo by the packed audience, chaired by Ian McWhirter. Not that he was cheering, he was simply chairing the event. Because, as he's already said, he doesn't agree with Professor Devine on these issues. But very impartially, he chaired that particular experience. One senior producer, who I particularly respect because of his record, said he is phoned weekly by colleagues who are still there, wanting to know how to get out. This is not redundancy by coercive financial means. This is redundancy because the morale in that station is so low. I'll come on to some of the specifics of it when we get to the debate stage. There is complete virtual contempt for senior management on the part of those who are actually the foot soldiers and the, if you like, the officers and the NCO class in that particular station, which of course they dared not raise in public fora because they are still employed by the organisation. There is no evidence that I have come across, listening to people and also appearing on Radio Scotland, that there is anything really wrong, despite the great hemorrhage, there's anything really wrong with the skilled personnel who are front of house, who actually do the business. The problem with Radio Scotland, as I shall discuss if given the opportunity in the second part of tonight, is in another area. And that area is verging on the Aegean stable in terms of the information that's been given to me by people whom I both trust and respect for their professional expertise. This is what one former senior producer says of the kind of programming that he has to listen to, given the number of times he and his colleagues received accolades in the 1990s. Inept pap, which is embarrassing and demeaning. We all know the programmes he's referring to. We dare not mention them, perhaps, but we all know what they are. It's an enormous tragedy, ladies and gentlemen, that as many Scottish listeners tune in to the Today programme now as to Good Morning Scotland. According to one source, and I cannot be certain about this, others round the table may know for more certain, like Ewan, who does a lot of work for Radio Scotland, is that Good Morning Scotland does not have a dedicated producer anymore. How has a once mighty, perhaps not perfect, but an outstanding organisation which existed in the 1990s come to this pass? So there's two analytical issues that need to be discussed, at least as far as RS is concerned, in the second part of the evening. One is the reasons for decline, or relative decline, according to the evidences, and this is not my view, the evidences I've tried to gather. And secondly, what can be done about it? And a number of the points raised by these individuals that I talked to are cogent and doable, even without additional resource. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
That wasn't the explosive part.
That wasn't the explosive part, as you just said. No doubt that will follow. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the rest of the proceedings are over to you. We're happy to take your questions. Try and keep them brief. And if you have a particular panel member you would like to respond to your question, if you would kindly indicate who that might be. Yes, sir. You need to come up here and use one of the mics, please. Just this one here, anyone, in fact. Yep.
Hi, my name's Robbie Pennington. This is less of a question, more of a plea, perhaps. And it was just to ask the panel to remember the roughly 300,000 of us in the south of Scotland who don't have Scottish independent TV, who receive our news and current affairs from Tyne Tees. And hopefully to ask if you could perhaps address that sometime during the evening.
Yeah, Joan would like to respond, in fact.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised. I'm glad you raised that point. I didn't want to go on beyond the 5 minutes, but I'm a South of Scotland regional member, and that is a very, very important issue. We had a cross-party group, not an official cross-party group, but an unofficial cross-party group in the Parliament last year looking at this. And you may be aware that the Department of Culture in London decided not to block the renewal of licences for Channel 3 a month ago, which means that STV will probably get its licence for Central and North Scotland, but ITV will continue with the coverage in the south of Scotland. Now, Maria Miller, the Culture Secretary in London, who obviously decides these things, did write to Ofcom and say that she expected them to look at improving news from Scotland in the south, because when we brought them before our cross-party group last year, they wouldn't even acknowledge that there was a problem with their news coverage in the south of Scotland. What is of great concern to me is I put down a motion in Parliament last week, and I'm hoping to have a debate on it, so maybe that directly answers your question. What's of concern to me is that the cross-party support that I was hoping to get for the motion, given the cross-party group last year, wasn't what I expected. Patricia Ferguson from Labour has signed it, and she's the culture spokesman, and she'll speak in the debate. But the Conservative and Liberal members, when I last looked, hadn't signed it. And I don't understand why that is. And actually, that's why I made the point that I hoped that this wasn't going to become a political political issue, like you give more Scottish content, it might make people more likely to vote SNP. That's not what this is about. It's about giving people information about their country and about their local area as well. And it's a real concern because STV have offered to give their non-news content at cost to ITV. So Scotland Tonight, which we should probably mention is one of the few really good things to have happened in Scottish broadcasting over the last year, is not available to people in the south of Scotland, and that's a really important forum, pitched at a different kind of audience as well, not political anorax, where people can actually get into the debate about things that are decided in this Parliament, not just the Constitution but health and other things. So I'm hoping that we get cross-party support for that debate, and I'll certainly let you know when it's happening if you want to give me your name and you can tune into it. So it should be sometime in the new year, because just lastly, I think it's really important to put pressure on Ofcom, who Maria Miller has told to speak to ITV to resolve this issue. So we're going to have a couple of months to do that. So the more pressure that we can put on them, not just to have regional news, but to have Scottish content in the south of Scotland is really important. Thanks.
Okay. No. Yes, sir.
Peter Curran, I'd like to take up a point that Ian McWhirter made, that he was confident.
Please, could you speak into the mic?
Even in the event of a no vote, there would be considerably more devolution to Scotland, a kind of Devo Plus, and that would include the BBC. Well, given that there's a powerful body of opinion that thinks that devolution is rather in the position of the crofter whose wife was being delivered of multiple births by the light of a candle, for God's sake, put out the candle, it's the light that's attracting them, that after a no vote we would get Devo minus.
Do you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not here as an advocate of devolution plus, devolution minus, or any of the other 57 varieties. I was just stating the observation, I think, that there will be a bit of a scramble. If Scotland votes no, I'm not prejudging that either. If Scotland votes no in 2014, I think there'll be a scramble to try to toss, you know, a few trinkets to the natives, as it were. And what they'll do is try to look at what powers can be other powers. Because all the parties, the Prime Minister, the Labour Party, have all committed themselves to Scotland having more power if Scotland votes no. Now, they may, you know, like Lord Hume, they may be completely cynical about that and may offer a better devolution which never materialises. But I think in this case, in this situation, I think pressure will be put on them to be a bit more specific about the kind of extra powers the Scottish Parliament will have if we move to this new stage of devolution, which, as I say, all three of the parties have promised. And I think one of the most obvious ones would be broadcasting, because it doesn't seem to me to make a great deal of sense to have press regulated by the Scottish Parliament, or potentially regulated independently by the Scottish Parliament, as it is at the moment, and for broadcasting not to be. I think that would be an anomaly which would very quickly be addressed.
Thanks, Ian. Before I invite Pete Murray, just let me say there is a further anomaly heaped upon anomalies here, in that the Scotland Act 2012, I understand, and John will no doubt correct me if I have misunderstood it, is that in future the BBC Trust member for Scotland will be a sort of joint appointment by the Scottish Government and the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. Am I right?
Yeah, the Scottish Government will have to approve. They'll check with the Scottish Government, but how the mechanism will actually work, we're not absolutely sure. But yeah, it has to be run past the Scottish Government.
But so therefore the member for Scotland would be run past the Scottish Government, but that wouldn't apply to the member for Northern Ireland, it wouldn't apply to the member for Wales, it wouldn't apply to any of the other members of the BBC Trust. So it is, as Ian says, well, it seems to me it's another anomaly. If I can introduce Pete Murray from the National Union of Journalists. Have I titled you correctly, Pete? I think you wanted to comment on the last point.
Yeah, thanks very much, John, and thanks for the invitation to speak. It's partly on the last point, but also I was very interested in what Professor Devine was saying and how he'd spoken to a number of people before coming to the meeting this evening. A couple of weeks ago, before I spoke to the Education and Culture Committee, I went through much the same process. I was speaking to some of my ex-colleagues at the BBC, getting their views as a journalist and as a trade unionist. But as a journalist, I investigated, spoke to people, made some notes about it. And the BBC responded to what I said before the committee by saying that they didn't recognise my description of what was going on inside the BBC, but that may reflect the people that I'd been speaking to. And so I wonder whether Tom may get the same kind of reaction to what he's saying this evening to his comments. I think the BBC management here in Scotland are being particularly blinkered in what they see. They think of themselves as taking a correct course of action here. The public seems to disagree with them. The trade unions certainly disagree with them. And it looks like Lord Patten now disagrees with them as well, because he's told them to come before the committee in this room and respond to what the NUJ and others have been saying about the state of BBC Scotland. I certainly agree. I go back in BBC Scotland to that vintage era, if you like. I mean, it was never a vintage era. It's very dangerous to look back on a lot of these periods as being a golden age or anything like that. It certainly wasn't that, but it certainly was a much easier environment to work in than it is now. And from our point of view in the National Union of Journalists, we'd absolutely I think Joan very much nailed the problem that it's not. I agree with Tom to some extent that it's not just about finance, but the financing of the news gathering operation. The less money there is around, the fewer people there are around, then the less diverse the news gathering operation becomes. And that's a great, great danger. And Kate also mentioned it as well. And so I think when it comes to the future of the BBC, whether it's under independence or under some sort of Devo Max operation, that it's an issue that the BBC nationally would have to address about opening themselves up to a more diverse audience. I think the kind of parameters, the vision of BBC Scotland has very definitely shrunk, and that may be a reflection of the staff, the area that the staff are gathered from. The NUJ certainly has concerns about the shrinking catchment area of journalism generally. And I think that's also reflected in Scotland. And so that's something that the BBC would have to address anyway, and does have to address it anyway. But I think looking at, again, going back to what Kate said, let's look at the glass being half full rather than half empty. At the moment, because of the referendum debate and the wider political debate that's going to be happening over the next two and a half years or so, and also because of the Leveson report and some of the issues that Leveson raises for, as Ian mentioned, regulation of the BBC and of the Scottish media more widely, I hope there is a chance to have a look at some of these issues in a more general format. I think from the NUJ's point of view, for a long, long time, we've been calling for a Scottish Media Commission and for wider Scottish regulation of the media. And I think I agree with Ian that it is almost certain that broadcasting will come under the auspices directly of the Scottish Parliament. We would certainly welcome that. But I think the regulatory system in Scotland, whether it's under independence or Devo Max, will have to address some of these wider issues that Kate was looking at, which have to do with the fact that the traditional media are no longer the only area that needs to be regulated and looked at. And so I think we would certainly welcome a wider spectrum for whatever method of regulation exists after 2014 and into 2015. I think there are a lot more issues at stake, but also crucially, financing of all of that is one of the big issues for us. And so a wider look at the licence fee and about how the press is funded in Scotland would certainly be worthwhile looking at. I think one of the other issues that John asked me to look at was what other trade unions are saying in Scotland about the devolution debate and so on. I'll be very, very brief about this because I don't want to dominate anything at all here. But I think that it's interesting how a lot of the trade unions in Scotland, whether they're the PCS or private sector trade unions, a number of the trade unions are now looking very seriously at what the future for organised workers will be in Scotland in the lead up to the referendum and thereafter. I think the only area that we can agree on, I hope, is that we should start this debate from the point of that social justice, equality and rights at work should be paramount as part of that debate. And the other trade unions are beginning to look at that. We can no longer take it for granted that the trade unions, because many of the trade unions are affiliated to the Labour Party, that they will therefore support the No campaign. That's no longer a given. And the STUC, for example, the umbrella body for all the trade unions, is now saying, don't take any of that for granted, and we will have to look to see whether we can foster a wider debate in the trade union movement. I think it is beginning to happen, and it's a much more open field, I think, for that debate.
Thanks very much, Pete.
Can I just make a few comments? Thank you very much for that. It's very interesting. So we've been both down the same track, probably talking to some of the same people. The other thing I was going to add was, in addition to what your recipe is, can I just give some of the points that I think, given the limited investigation that I undertook, would help to assist the situation of improvement. Like everybody who's said this, I think broadcasting is likely to be devolved, but that won't change anything. What will have to go along with that are other parallel developments. The developments are going to be, how do we get senior management in the BBC in Scotland to listen? Because the track record so far is that they don't listen very easily. I'll give you an example of this. The night before Pacific Quay was opened, a number of Scots, 10 of us in all, were invited to dinner with what was then called the BBC, I'm confused now, it's now trustees, is it? The governors.
It's the BBC Trust.
It's BBC Trust now, but then I think it maybe had a different name. And because the BBC were hosting the dinner, there was a lot of politeness around until, with the conspicuous absence of 2 university vice-chancellors, both female, who were obviously attempting to, to develop a deal for a number of reasons, maybe courses, etc., with the BBC. For 2 hours, the senior management of BBC Scotland and all the trustees or governors had to listen to a sustained attack from virtually everybody around that table. And they were talking about people like the director of the Edinburgh International Festival, the Vicky Featherstone, who's about to go to, leave the National Theatre, and a number of other people who had no reason to be like that. But what effect did it have? Zero. Zero effect. And the same sort of points that some of us might be able to come up with tonight were being said at that stage. So how do you do that? That's the first point. Second thing, from my investigation, I don't know whether it's also supported by yours, an urgent need for a new head of radio, a true leader who can develop the station and also stand up for it. A management structure which includes a radio representative at current affairs level, also allied with editors who are willing to battle for resources and not simply accept what London wants. And then the resource thing, you're right, obviously the resource issue it's not simply about approach, it's not simply about how things are done, although certainly my contacts suggest that's the vital thing, rather than resource. You're not going to get more money out of the BBC generally, but I would have thought that the Scottish Parliament in particular, after the devolution of broadcasting, could ask at least for a period of budgetary protection so that, and I'm thinking specifically now about Radio Scotland, so that there would be a period of time given to it to recover and move towards, not the golden age of the 1990s, but at least a degree of improvement. The other thing is the Audience Council should be scrapped. Its comments are cosmetic. They do not deal with the major issues that some of us at least are talking about tonight. They do critique, they do have criticisms, but if you look at their national reports, their annual and national reports, what they have to say is of arcane, semi-relevant value. And who are they? Where are the big beasts, if you want to use that term again, of the Scottish nation who should be on it? And don't forget, they are appointed by the BEAB.
These are good points, Tom.
I haven't finished. There's one other thing I wanted to say.
Just one more then.
Yeah, there's 2 things which have come up tonight. I like the comparative perspective. Small nations learn best by seeing all aspects of their activities in comparative perspective. And we've had delicious examples. We're all hooked on Scandinavian criminality. Apart from Ian Rankin, by the way, who regards it as a rival competitor. And the final thing is, it would be wonderful to see programmes made in Scotland, but not about Scotland, which sell across the world.
Thank you, Tom. Ian, and then Ewan, and then we'll take another question.
It's a structural thing, essentially. And Tom's right to say it's not simply about money, although money is an enormous part of it. Money is 80% of it. The rest is the structural relationship between the BBC in Scotland and the BBC in London. And it's encapsulated in the Newsnight phenomenon, where you have Newsnight, the big Newsnight, and then you have the little Scottish Newsnight tagged on at the end, which really sums up the Scottish cringe almost because of the way in which it crashes into the middle of an interview or some link being read by Jeremy Paxman. I mean, they refuse even to time the programme so that the Scottish programme can start at its proper moment.
But the thing is, with Gordon Brewer apparently trying to be as laid back as Paxman.
This encapsulates, that is microcosm the problem with the BBC. You've got to remember that it's set up to be a local operation. It's local radio, it's local television. And the only reason I disagree slightly with Tom in condemning it, and it's been condemned. I started in the BBC in the Devolution unit. That was in 1979, not 1997, 1979. And at that time, that was only a year after the BBC had launched Radio Scotland, it was an issue of national moment. People were calling it a national disgrace, Scotland's national disgrace. And it's been condemned quite rightly in many respects ever since. However, there are a lot of and the only reason I qualify this is because it's very easy to just indulge constantly in the Scottish cringe and condemn everything that is produced in Scotland, and we're kind of culturally predisposed to that, partly because of our history. But there are a lot of people who are trying to do good stuff even in Radio Scotland. And if you look at Radio Scotland's schedules and listen to some of the programmes, you will find some surprising corners there, which are quite good. Anyway, so it's a structural problem. It's a political problem for that reason, and I think until you get broadcasting devolved, I don't think it's going to be addressed. But I think it could be started being addressed quite quickly thereafter. The moment the BBC, as we know, regards itself as an integrative institution, it's something that holds the United Kingdom together. This was made explicit by John Birt when he went to speak to Tony Blair. He recounts it in his autobiography, how John Birt said, we've got to hold the country together, so we can't allow Scotland to have its own national broadcasting. But I think that very Unitarian, that monolithic approach would be dissolved quite quickly once broadcasting is devolved. Not because of any political interference, but just because there will be that cultural change, there will be a recognition in the BBC that BBC Scotland does have a status as a national broadcaster, and therefore it will begin to get, I think, the resources and the remit to be appropriate for that.
Thanks, Ian. Ewan and Joan.
I mean, I agree with most of what Ian said there. A further structural point that Radio Scotland, we talk about Radio Scotland, but it's a bit of a nonsense, I think, that we simply have one public service broadcast radio station in Scotland. And part of the problem, I think, is that it has to be a news station, a sports station, an art station, a light entertainment station, music of all sorts of different kinds. Now, they have a split frequency, which they use for sport, but that seems to me, a country of 5 million people, just to have one all-speech station. No wonder it sounds a little bit confused at times. Just on a specific point that Tom made, Good Morning Scotland, people correct me here, it doesn't have a dedicated editor anymore. The person who is the editor has actually a very wide range of responsibilities. It has dedicated producers, but not a dedicated editor, and that clearly is a real issue. You just cannot imagine a situation where the Today programme in Radio 4 would not have a dedicated editor.
Thanks, Ewan. Joan?
Yeah, if I could just come in and say I do agree with the gentleman, Peter, in the audience, and disagree with some members of the panel, in that I don't think that we should be too sure that a no vote will result in the devolution of broadcasting, and I think that the debate around Levison shows that. The reaction of some of the unionist parties to the very suggestion that you should have a press regulator that was in Scotland, even though we're talking about Scots law. I don't think that would have happened if we were having this debate about press regulation 20 odd years ago before the Parliament. Because, as someone who worked in newspapers then, we had a very strong sense of ourselves as a Scottish press, and we actually were very proud of the fact that, contempt laws were different here and defamation laws were different here, and we saw ourselves as an industry. And so I think if we were having that debate now, there would be no question that if we're going to regulate press and it's going to have a legal underpinning, of course it should be in Scotland. And the fact that the unionist parties, although they're kind of, I think they're now sort of perhaps moderating their tone, but the initial response was you shouldn't have, you must have a UK-wide regulator, you shouldn't be taking more power to the Parliament, even though the original Scotland Act gave us that. So I think we need to be very careful, because my concern would be that that if we vote no, it will be pretty impossible to get any additional powers for the Parliament. I think we'll see a period of retrenchment.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. This is a question based on what I've heard this evening, and it's been really illuminating, some of the facts and figures that have come out. One comment and question really would be that if regulations are indeed coming to Scotland, or the regulatory regime would come to this building, picking up on Kate's point, I can't for the life of me see why spend would not follow. And if the number 10% of the BBC budget equates to 352 million, why that wouldn't follow regulations. But like Joan said, I'm quite sure in the event of a no vote that there's no chance that would happen. In connection to the Constitutional Commission organisation of this, and given what Ewan said earlier about the very limited reach of broadcast media into a large number of Scottish households as it stands right now, I'd like to ask the panel whether a London-centric media is in fact consistent with modern democracy at all.
Right. Who would like to start with that one?
I think that deserves the Alistair Gray response. No.
Patrick, did you want to make a comment?
I wanted to make a quick comment about the finances, and finances have come up. I agree that finances aren't everything, but there's one aspect of how broadcasting, and the BBC in particular, is funded that hasn't really come up, and it's about being advertising free. In thinking about what I want as a citizen and as a viewer and a listener, there's tremendous cultural value in having a broadcaster that doesn't contain advertising, that doesn't contain a constant stream of corporate messages, consume, consume, consume. To me, in many ways, this is more important than having proper political representation in the media. And it seems to me that the loss of that would be tremendously significant. We do need either the devolution or the independence of broadcasting. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that both are possibilities. I'm not convinced, but for the sake of argument, let's say they're both possibilities. But we need more than that. The BBC is underpinned by a royal charter and two documents, a licence and agreement, that come from that. And that's what provides the basis of public service broadcasting funded by a licence fee. If those documents had to be agreed by more than one government, whether that's a UK government and a devolved government, or several devolved governments, or a separate independent Scottish government, it would provide a double lock protection against the ethos of public service broadcasting. It would provide a really clear structural incentive for the BBC to take those different jurisdictions seriously. It would avoid breaking up the single biggest news gathering machine on the planet, and I think it would give us a clear protection for unadvertised broadcasting, which is going to become even more important in the age when media and digital media are changing and proliferating, and our data about us becomes the product. So even if we're not being directly advertised at, we become the product. And I think keeping an advertising-free element of broadcasting and all of those other digital media is profoundly important.
How comfortable are you with the fact that the BBC overseas has commercials? I travel around more than I should.
In my idealistic moments, I'd love it if the whole world had advertising-free television and radio and broadcasting. But at heart, this is about the kind of media that we have in this country, that we pay for collectively through licence fees paid in this country, Scotland and the rest of the UK, and it has to be about trying to provide something on a collective basis rather than a purely commercially funded basis.
And if that was supported by advertising, but not here, but elsewhere, would you be comfortable with that?
I think overseas advertising is a part of the revenue that's part of its commercial external operations, just like selling produced product to overseas broadcasters as well. I don't have a fundamental objection to that, but I have a fundamental loyalty to the idea of broadcasting without advertising as something that's culturally necessary.
There's also an issue which dare not speak its name, and that is, you know, let's face it, a number of the people who are represented here are members of the so-called chattering classes. What is the great Scottish public thinking about all this? And the Jenkins Committee, you know, the Blair Jenkins Commission, one of the things that it tried to ascertain was this idea of a second channel, that is a second radio channel, which would be speech-based. They actually carried out survey material on this very question, and there was no interest in it among the general public whatsoever.
Well, I think the question was about whether or not the present broadcasting setup is, makes any sense given the constitutional changes that have already taken place. And it has to be said it doesn't make any sense. I mean, if you watch Question Time or any network news bulletin, you'll find about 30 to 40% of it's completely irrelevant in Scotland because of the fact that the National Health Service is running in a very different way south of the border, and because education, both secondary and higher education, are going in a very different way south of the border. And I mean, I can't think of any other country where this would happen, where people sort of sit passively and they accept news bulletins about things that are happening in other countries which aren't actually relevant in Scotland. And again, I think that it's such a glaring anomaly that once, it is brought to light and people are asked to kind of account for this, then they would have to rejig this so that you did have Scottish-based news bulletins, which doesn't mean that they would be parochial, but just that they would give proper, significance to things which are actually devolved in Scotland, like the health service, like higher education, like secondary education.
Yeah, I think a moot point as well about Question Time is that it's billed as a BBC Scotland programme, as I understand it, because Mentorn has a little broom cupboard somewhere, and it's billed as a BBC Scotland programme. And I think that was that Ewan made the point earlier. I think that's a really concerning issue that we have now got up to the level of network programming. I believe that even the Broadcasting Commission said that we should have, but most of it is absolutely completely irrelevant to Scotland, and there's a big question mark over whether it actually employs anyone here. I just wanted to just make an observation. I think the question was whether a London-centric media is consistent with democracy, and I just wanted to sort of draw on my experience from working in print newspapers, where you're the Scottish outpost of a London operation, and it does affect the way that you cover news. Just like this network programme broadcast, even if it's network programme broadcast from Scotland about Scotland, it's tailored to the country that you're broadcasting it to, which is other parts of the UK. And certainly when you look at newspapers like the Sunday Times or the Daily Mail, quite often they'll want to have their perceptions of Scotland, certain prejudices about Scotland, reinforced. For example, certainly when the Mail and some of the other papers set up in Scotland, the whole tone of debate changed in Scotland, whereas the print media before devolution were really supportive of the idea of a parliament. Once you got papers like the Mail moving in, you got an awful lot, and this is before the SNP government, you got an awful lot of coverage sort of attacking the quality of people in the Parliament, attacking the whole concept of the Parliament. And that seeped into other areas of journalism as well in Scotland, into what we would call the indigenous media. So I think that's another very important reason why the lines of command they have to be here in Scotland from an editorial point of view as well. They have to be relevant to Scottish people. And if I could just get one example of that, the internet is obviously where a lot of news is delivered now. And BBC Scotland boast about its internet site, but the only time that they open up Scottish stories to comment on the internet site, as I can see, is when they're picked up nationally. And I can see, if I couldn't pin them down and where their editorial lines of command are, but if their editorial lines of command for internet are down south, and that will actually change. The kind of stories that we'll get on the national site will be geared towards national predilections, or the UK national predilections. And for example, last year when the SNP government launched the Green Paper on higher education, this is before the election, the Green Paper outlined various options for higher education, and it was kind of, the message was that it was likely to be free, and that we would have to charge students from elsewhere in the UK. Now, the way it was covered in Scotland by all the papers was how does this address concerns of universities in Scotland to meet the funding gap? That was the overwhelming angle of the story in this country. The angle that they chose to write the internet story on the BBC site was Scots are going to charge English students to study in Scotland. So it became this big anti-English story. It got lots of hits on the site, and I'm sure BBC Scotland internet people thought that's great, we've got lots of readers for our story. But it was not the way that the story was of interest to people reading in Scotland. And it also then influenced lots of the other BBC coverage as well. So you would have, the politics show was discussing how the Scottish Parliament was going to charge English students, and we were anti-English. And so I just think that you need to look at that in terms of the lines of editorial command actually change the way you actually report Scottish stories.
Thanks, John. Ewan?
Yeah. Just to pick up Ian's point, which I think is a really important one, the BBC is aware of the difficulties in terms of, or it's been told about the difficulties of covering things like health and education, particularly since devolution. There was a report by Professor Anthony King from Essex University in 2008, and they had a survey period looking at the number of stories covered about particularly health, education and criminal justice issues, and they found, I can't remember the exact figures, but in the sample period there were 133 stories in those areas. And every single one of them was related to England. And they then revisited it 2 years later and found a marginal improvement, but it was just a marginal improvement. And since then, nothing much has been said. There's actually a new verb that BBC journalists have introduced south of the border, which is to king a report. And we'll probably have seen it on the news that will say in England and Wales, and then maybe a line about Scotland. And as far as they're concerned, that's the job done. And I think there's a real issue, and it's not just the BBC, I think ITV, we have to look at this too, that particularly in the run-up to the referendum, is half-hour news bulletin after the network news and then 5 or 7 minutes later on. Is that really sufficient to carry out the citizen function? The Scotland Tonight programme, probably run on pretty limited resource, as already been mentioned, has been a tremendous benefit. And very interestingly, they in themselves have been surprised about the viewing figures they've got for that. And it goes out still at 10:30, so a time when there are competing programmes on. So there probably is a big demand for that, but I just cannot see how the BBC in particular can carry on in the run-up to 2014 with the Reporting Scotland setup that is at the moment.
Just to add a bit of colour to that, I assume that you're referring to the Anthony King report when they talk about King. The Anthony King report, and you can dig this out if you like, said that in terms of BBC coverage of the 4 UK nations, that a large proportion of the coverage is vague, confusing or inaccurate. If they do specify countries of application, they tend to do it only once. The UK, Britain and England are often used interchangeably. We, us and they are often used when talking about England. Attempts to compare and contrast policies between the nations are rare. Coverage of politics across the 4 nations is often seen through Westminster eyes. There are 6 other points, bullet points, which I won't bore you with. It becomes tedious after a while. This report, by the way, was published in June 2008. So none of the issues we're talking about tonight have are unknown. And I don't want to talk too much about the BBC, but I would just ask...
you see it all the time, and you've got the coverage of the GCSE issue since last summer, and the problems they were having there. That got massive coverage in all the bulletins. Compare that with the coverage in the network media about the Scottish new curriculum for excellence, which never featured at all. That's the kind of problem you get. You get this kind of overload. It's very strange when you're working in the media in Scotland, because you have this kind of huge overload of London-based material, which is very difficult to translate into Scottish terms. And quite often, people just capitulate it, and they start saying, well, it's us, and they ignore the Scottish dimension altogether.
By the way, the King report also said that reports from elsewhere in the UK that get national coverage are usually about crime, sport, or human interest, or merely quirky. I think we can all recognise that. Could I just ask very quickly, if I may indulge, how the panellists feel about addressing Tom's point about if broadcasting were devolved, would terribly much change? And maybe one way to effect such a change would be how the broadcasting regulator is organised. I mean, for example...
The variable of change to a devolved system would have to go along with other variables, and the chances of those other influences being brought to bear, I think, would be much significantly greater if there had, first of all, been the devolved process. But the devolved process is by no means a panacea and contains its own dangers if implemented alone.
One way to effect a huge change would be to say, let any Scottish Broadcasting Corporation, whatever terminology is appropriate, let it be elected.
You mean the Regulatory Commission?
No, what I'm saying is that the body in charge of broadcasting...
I mean, anything would be better than the patronage system that exists at the moment, which is 18th century in its vibrancy. So, I mean, anything like that, I think, opening the thing up, getting people's views. But I go back to the point I made earlier. How does the Parliament here, even in the current situation, bring influence to bear to try and change things? They probably will not be able to affect very quickly the resource situation. But I'm thinking of how the skill in the BBC is allowed to flourish here in order, by dint of changes in managerial attitude. There seems to be a combination of deafness and blindness. I don't know of anybody, in particular the chattering classes, recognising that there are pockets of excellence, as we've all said tonight, would root and branch defend the existing system. It is a suitable case for treatment. But how do you do that when people are not even willing to appear before the committees of this House?
In 2007, I was kind of peripherally involved in setting up the Scottish Broadcasting Commission, and that had a direct impact. First of all, it had the King report. The King report was largely a response to the Scottish Broadcasting Commission's report, and that was very critical of the present arrangements, and its recommendations were not implemented, but you have to keep the pressure up. The second thing was that the BBC did restructure its affairs, and it pumped a lot more money north of the border. Now, a lot of it went into areas like, Waterloo Road and Question Time, which weren't directly addressing the problem of, if you like, the broadcasting deficit in Scotland, which is the fact that there isn't a national broadcaster to reflect a national political culture here. But these were important steps. And the point is the Parliament must realise that it does have power, it does have influence, and if it keeps at it, there will be changes.
And it should also, the Parliament should get madder about it.
Get madder, absolutely.
It should be much more aware.
And Joan's been very good at getting mad about it, I can tell you.
Should be brazenly engaged with this and get really mad about it, because it is a vital part of our national life.
There's some pointers there. Yes.
I'm just a wee bit annoyed that the people's voice is not being heard too much. Never mind. That's by the way. The point I want to make is that cultural cringe is part of our whole cultural heritage. It's endemic in this society. When I was in primary school, I had a Gaelic-speaking headmaster who beat every child who spoke Gaelic. I come from that background. Now I can't listen to Radio Scotland. It makes me cringe. I'm belting myself. And what I'm saying is psychologically Scotland's like that. Our democratically elected First Minister can be called wee egg in Parliament, and we all think it's a laugh. We are all belting ourselves. Tom knows that in order to stop a people being vital, you stop their voice, and we beat ourselves with our own cultural cringe. Now, how do you change the psychology? Because I don't think we will get a devolved media service at all in Scotland if they do sort of...
Obviously what you're saying is historically accurate.
Absolutely.
But I think there is a sea change, and I think there's some evidence of that, especially among the next generation. Patrick and I had the privilege of listening to some of that next generation on a programme on BBC television, of which we were panel members. And obviously there had been a lot of training being put into the 1,000 youngsters who came from all over Scotland to speak. But by God, they were articulate. And they were much more articulate than my generation could ever be. And I teach, especially in the University of Edinburgh, because of its high proportion of students from certain social backgrounds south of the border. And I'm not talking about housing schemes in Newcastle either. And I've seen, after having a lifetime experience of Strathclyde, Aberdeen University and now Edinburgh, I have seen, certainly among that age group compared to mine, the cringe is, if not melting away, it's a generation which has got a greater sense of itself. And there's a whole variety of indicators that under the surface, I'm talking now as a historian, beneath the surface there are changes going on, not least in culture, in history writing, in the cultural dynamic of everything from art to music, to pop music, to the kind of thing we were talking about yesterday on Start the Week. And so I would agree with you, but I think the situation is now becoming unrelentingly more complex in this small country than it was, say, 30 to 40 years ago. I mean, it always interests me that the great popular author of that period in terms of my subject area was John Preble in the 1960s, late 50s, 60s and early 70s, whose story of Scotia was tragedy. The Highland clearances, Culloden, the Darien disaster and all that. And he was able to write very well. So he certainly sold a lot more than academics. But now, the new flavour of the month is the Scottish Enlightenment, subtitled How Western Europe's Poorest People Invented Our World and Everything in It. This is the citation index for the government, the governing party of which you are a part. I mean, I've heard every single cabinet secretary quote from that vacuous text, and very rarely from the texts of indigenous Scottish historians, because that text is written by an American whom we like to stroke us. Okay? But so I think there's a sense in our reading matter we're beginning to move from the cringe area to a level of, benign braggadocio. Benign braggadocio. But I think I agree with you that probably the core of the nation is still where it was. The changes, however, I hope at least, are underway. And this building is a manifestation of that.
That's a positive message. I think we have some questions here and there.
Hi, I'm John Thompson. I was actually the member of the public who managed to get on Newswatch to do with the comment facility being removed from the general public. And what I discovered was that usually when the production team don't put someone up, it's usually because they've got an unanswerable case. And on my particular slot, BBC Scotland sent in a statement instead of putting somebody up. And the statement was actually, the production team actually asked me, what does that statement mean? So the BBC couldn't understand what their own BBC Scotland statement meant. And it was absolute gobbledygook. The thing which so it was really to touch on the comments thing, how that public deficit is going to be addressed. And one final question in the style of question time is the stupid question at the end. How terminally ill now is BBC Scotland when people are starting to believe the stories that are appearing on a spoof site called BBC Scotlandshire more than BBC Scotland?
There's no answer to that. Yes, madam.
It's concentrated quite rightly on Scotland's national broadcasting vis-à-vis the BBC, but I don't think we should forget about the regional aspects of Scotland as well. You know, I come from the northeast. We've lost Grampian TV. We used to make really good programmes, and we haven't addressed tonight at all the regionalisation, the regions of Scotland, and we shouldn't look at it as one homogenous Glasgow-centric BBC Scotland that gives you your sport and your weather. You know, we've got to think about the regions of Scotland as well. And, you know, to address Ian's point about the media, the print press, you know, maybe it's because of the Glasgow-centric radio and TV broadcasting that the P&J, with its many editions, is bucking the trend of other Scottish national newspapers. So I don't think we should forget about that.
The success of the P&J is a metaphor for the kind of thing you're talking about. And the recognition that, although we're a very small country, and I think, thinking of some of the comments of my American graduate students, it's a mosaic of a country. It's a veritable wee mosaic of accents, cultures, activities and concerns. And certainly the media, if it's at all possible, should reflect that in a way that the P&J, for some parts of Scotland, does so magnificently.
Ian Grant, obviously the cringe issue is getting better. Yes, it's getting better despite the efforts of the BBC. I mean, if you look around Scotland from Ullapool to Salmorostig to all around the country, there's wonderful cultural things going on. There's good music, there's good drama, there's good discussion, political fora and so on. None of that, absolutely zero, is reflected in the output of BBC Scotland. There's no regional stuff within Scotland. There's absolutely no decent output. And we're not talking about politics. I mean, politics is important, but the cultural side is awful. And of course, because there's now virtually nothing. We used to criticise the White Heather Club and so on, but there's just zero now. And so that anything that ever creeps through is inevitably poor, and it's really cringeworthy, a lot of it. And I just don't know what you do about it. I just think it's so bad. Everybody in this room has been sort of saying, well, the BBC's not glass half full and so on. It's not, it's awful. And it's completely and utterly devaluing this country. I mean, this country that has done so much in all fields, and yet we have to put up with just an abomination of a broadcasting
Well said, sir. But I hate to be immodest about this, but that's more or less the line I've been taking, less eloquently than yourself, all night. Get angry people about it. It's a disgrace, and as I said during that debate, because I was the anonymous contributor when Ian was the chair, it is a national humiliation. Get angry about it. We must get something done about it. ASCP.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Rob Connell. I was interested to hear someone say that the BBC does regard one of its key roles as being someone who holds the United Kingdom together. And I think that's been reflected in much of its coverage of the independence debate. And indeed in much of the rest of the media as well. I'd just like to ask the panel if they believe, well, how damaging do you think that is to the quality of the independence debate, and indeed how damaging it might be to the reputation of the BBC, and what can be done about it?
Sorry, who would like to respond first? Yes, sir, at the back. Yeah, and then.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. It's really to do with what Tom Devine's saying. I can continually hear people saying, how are we going to do something about it? I can get angry, like lots of people I know get angry about it, but we seem to be unable to deal with it. John and I sat in front of the BBC Trust being told that by definition they were independent, and the guy who said this was a political advisor, and he said it without any hint of irony and a straight face, because the Queen appointed the bloke. I mean, you know, it's so bad. As the gentleman said earlier, BBC Scotlandshire is more credible. But what can we do about it when the BBC Trust produces a report proud of its output, despite the fact it's referring to criticism, inept though the Audience Council is, and puts up as its headline success, Mrs. Brown, for Christ's sake. You know, it's an Irish programme, but they're proud of that being fantastically successful. They don't seem to have any sense of shame, and no one seems capable of being able to get at them. So
that is so brilliant. Thank you for that. The buck stops with this House here. This is the only forum that can do something about it. It might not be able to do very much about it at the moment, but it's the only source of pressure coming from the national voice of the nation. And I don't think they're doing enough, frankly.
We don't have too much more time. Yes, sir.
Personally, I feel it's the job of the state broadcaster not merely to inform, but to nurture debate and discussion amongst the general population. I'm very fortunate that I was one of the generation that grew up with the internet, and I've been online since about 1988 and part of the blogger network. It's not a recent phenomenon. I find it deeply, deeply offensive that the population of Scotland is not allowed to comment on political articles online on BBC Scotland, where other parts of the UK can comment on their own stories. And there was recently almost an accident whereby we were allowed to comment on the Barusa letter and the Scotsman article. And there wasn't a lot of hasty, nasty comment. It was a very cultured, political, sensible debate with some very worthwhile discussion. And why is the BBC Scotland so afraid of the population having their say at a public level?
Okay. You must bear in mind we may be thrown out at any minute, but I'd rather have your questions than... Yes, madam.
Can I just say that there's another way in which to try and influence the BBC? I stopped paying my licence fee and stopped watching it, and if everybody in Scotland was to do that and they were to lose 325 million, that might have some impact as well.
I'm not altogether sure there's a connection between those two connections. Yes.
I actually want it's too late now really to explore the whole question of the opt-out on the BBC, because two things are really problematic. One, I've been involved and know many people who've been trying to put forward very, very good programme ideas to BBC Scotland, many of which have not been taken up because there's simply not either the money to do it or certainly the airtime to actually even run it. And there's nowhere else really to go with a lot of that stuff. And recently, the film that was handed to BBC Scotland on a plate, You've Been Trumped, was rejected by BBC Scotland. Now, as it happens, that was probably quite a good idea because they got an enthusiastic response in London and it was seen by 3 million people or whatever, whereas it had gone out in a Scottish opt-out, you know, we'd have just seen it. But it seems to me you cannot have a national, we just need to accept, you cannot have a proper national broadcaster who's having to opt out of basically a much larger country's, the UK's, national broadcaster. It just didn't work.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's the point that's been made time and time again.
I'm not quite sure why we're having this meeting, because I mean, you know...
Well, well, I can offer a whole bunch of reasons, but...
Good.
Yeah. So, yes, Ewan, I think this probably needs to be the very last question.
Perhaps a solution, if I might, gathering all the range of comments, criticisms and other views around broadcast media, regulatory issue, local press being allowed to be bought up by large international businesses and the diminution of quality that we've seen as a result of things like that. But in summary, a solution to all of this problem probably lies in 2014 and voting yes, because at that point this Parliament will have the proper control over the outcomes that we want.
Thank you for that. We need to bring proceedings to a close. As I said, we're probably way beyond our allotted time here, and I don't want to sort of presume too much on the services here. Can I please ask you all to join me in thanking the panel, who I think have been fantastic tonight. And if we get an opportunity next year, perhaps we can continue this debate in a more extended form. I'd also like you, please, to thank the people from the Constitutional Commission. I want to give them a name check, because none of this can happen without a lot of hard work from a lot of dedicated people. And in particular, I'd like to thank Alex Grant. I'd like to thank Hisashi, who've done a fantastic amount of work here, together with John and all the others. None of this, again, at the risk of repeating myself, would be possible without them. And I'd like you, on behalf of me, to thank them. And last but by no means least, I think you ought to applaud yourselves, because I think you've made a major contribution to the success of this evening. As I said earlier, there is a box outside for donations, and there's also a box for suggestions, because we intend to continue this series of lectures next year, and we very much appreciate your views on the topics and themes and subjects that we ought to be addressing during the course of next year. So your suggestions are very much appreciated. If you feel that you don't want to make a suggestion right now, by all means go to our Facebook page. And one last plug, and that is that a member of the Constitutional Commission, in fact, is organising a conference on a Scottish Constitution at the Sorbonne in March next year. And I think there are maybe one or two places open there for observers. The speakers will consist of some of the most illustrious constitutional experts from across the world. So it serves to underscore the fact that though the coverage here may be somewhat patchy, the interest elsewhere never ceases to diminish. In fact, it tends to enhance. So there's lots of things happening out there. There's lots of things for the media in various forums to report. And I think that is likely to continue and grow. I thank you again, all of you, for your attention tonight. And please look forward to the next series of meetings next year. Thank you again.